3 blips on a screen. That was all it took to change everything the Sovan Empire believed about humans. Lieutenant Jir saw the blips first. He was stationed at Outpost 11, a metal box floating at the edge of the demilitarized zone between Sovan and Drekkery space. Nothing interesting ever happened at Outpost 11. Ships passed through the corridor twice a day, all registered, all scanned, all boring. Jared spent 9 months watching screens and writing reports that nobody read. But this ship was different. It appeared on the edge of the sensor grid like a whisper. Small, battered, running on barely enough power to keep its lights on. No weapons signature. No shield output. No identification broadcast. Jer leaned forward and tapped the console. Unregistered vessel in Corridor 7. No response to automatic hail. His supervisor, a tired Sovan named Pelik, glanced over with 2 of his 4 eyes. Scavenger? Maybe. The hull profile matches a human-class freighter. That single word changed the temperature in the room. Human. Every Sovan officer learned about humans during basic training. Death-class planet of origin. Gravity 1.4 times galactic standard. Atmosphere thick with a corrosive gas they actually needed to breathe. Predator species with forward-facing eyes, dense bones, and an immune system that waged constant biological warfare inside their own bodies. Pelik sat up straighter. Track it. Do not engage. I am calling Counselor Redis. Counselor Redis was not supposed to be at Outpost 11. He was a senior diplomat and intelligence chief who had come for a routine inspection of border operations. He was tall even by Sovan standards, with pale blue skin and 4 sharp eyes that missed nothing. When Pelik told him about the unregistered human vessel, Redis walked to the observation deck without a word and stood there, watching the tiny dot on the tracking display. Pull the ship registry, Redis said quietly. Jer ran the search. The results were not comforting. The freighter was registered to a decommissioned human military unit. Its last known location was a conflict zone on the far side of human space. The pilot was listed as a single occupant, name redacted, service record sealed. A soldier, Redis said. He folded his long fingers together. A human soldier, alone, in a ship with no weapons, drifting through our border corridor. Could be a deserter, Pelik offered. Could be a scout, Redis replied. Could be bait. Humans are unpredictable. That is what makes them dangerous. He ordered Jer to follow the vessel at maximum sensor range. Do not get close. Do not make contact. Just watch. Jer took a fast patrol craft and slipped into the corridor behind the human ship. At this distance, his instruments could read the freighter's hull like a medical chart. The ship was in terrible condition. Patched armor plating. Jury-rigged engine housing. A life support system that was cycling air through what appeared to be a filtration unit built from salvage parts. Whoever was flying this ship was not wealthy. They were not well supplied. They were surviving, barely, on the edge of nothing. For 6 hours, the human ship drifted through the corridor at low speed. It did not scan its surroundings. It did not attempt communication. It moved like something tired, something that had been moving for a very long time and had forgotten how to stop. Jer reported every detail back to Redis. The counselor listened without interruption, his 4 eyes focused on something far away. Then the human ship changed course to IT happened suddenly. One moment the freighter was drifting along the standard corridor path. The next, it banked hard and accelerated toward the outer edge of the zone. Jer checked the navigation chart and felt his stomach drop. The new heading pointed directly at the wreckage field. 3 days earlier, a Drekkery colony transport had been destroyed in the demilitarized zone. Over 400 Drekkery civilians were killed. Both sides blamed each other. The wreckage was still floating in a cloud of twisted metal and frozen atmosphere, and neither government had sent recovery teams because doing so might be seen as an act of aggression. The site was politically toxic. Nobody went near it, except this human. Jer opened a secure channel to Outpost 11. Counselor, the human vessel is changing course, heading toward the Drekkery wreckage field. There was a long silence on the other end. Follow, Redis said, and record everything. Jer pushed his patrol craft forward, staying just outside detection range. The human freighter moved with sudden purpose now, as if the pilot had woken up from a long sleep. Its sensors were active for the first time, sweeping the wreckage field ahead. Looking for something, Jer watched the freighter slide into the cloud of broken metal and frozen debris. The pilot navigated the wreckage with a skill that surprised him. The ship twisted and rolled through gaps in the floating destruction, avoiding jagged hull sections and tumbling cargo containers with precise, quiet movements. This was not the flying of a scavenger looking for valuable parts. This was someone searching, someone who knew what they were looking for. The freighter slowed near a shattered section of the colony ship's lower deck. Jer zoomed his sensors in and saw what the human had found out a life sign. Faint, weak, barely registering on his instruments. But alive. Something was still alive in that wreckage. The human ship extended a docking clamp and locked onto the broken hull. An airlock cycled open. A single figure in a patched environment suit stepped out into the dark. Jer stared at his screen and whispered to himself, "What are you doing out here?" He did not know it yet, but the answer to that question was going to change the way his entire species looked to humans. The wreckage smelled like burned metal and frozen death. Danny Hollow knew that smell. She had lived inside it for 11 days once, back on Earth, crawling through the ruins of a field hospital that her own side had bombed by mistake. That was a lifetime ago. A different war. A different version of herself. But the smell never changed. Destruction smelled the same everywhere in the universe. She pulled herself through the shattered corridor of the Dreckery colony ship, her environment suit scraping against twisted beams and crumpled wall panels. The gravity had failed when the ship broke apart, so she floated through the dark, using her hands to push off surfaces and guide herself deeper into the wreckage. Her scanner beeped softly. The life sign was close. Weak but steady, like a candle flame in a closed room. She found the source behind a collapsed bulkhead on the lower passenger deck. A small body, pinned under a slab of ceiling plating. Fur covered, wide dark eyes closed. A child. Danny guessed the kid was maybe 5 or 6 years old by human standards, though she had no idea how Dreckery aged. The child was breathing, but barely. A deep gash ran along her side, sealed by frozen blood and the cold vacuum that had leaked into this section before emergency barriers had kicked in. The barriers had saved the child's life, trapping a small pocket of breathable air around her, but the air was running out. The temperature was dropping. Danny had maybe 2 hours before the pocket failed completely. She did not waste time thinking about whether this was a good idea. She never did. She just started working. The ceiling slab weighed more than she could lift normally, but in zero gravity, mass was different from weight. She braced her boots against the wall, gripped the edge of the slab, and pushed. It shifted slowly, grinding against the floor. She pushed again. Her arms burned. Her shoulders screamed. The slab moved another few inches, that on the third push, it floated free. Danny grabbed the child carefully and pulled her into her arms. The kid was light, fragile. Her fur was matted with dry blood and dust. Up close, Danny could see the Dreckery child had large round ears pressed flat against her skull and tiny hands with 6 fingers each, curled into tight fists even while unconscious. Danny opened her field med kit and got to work. She cleaned the wound, applied a biofoam sealant that she had modified to work on non-human tissue, and wrapped the child's torso in thermal bandaging. She checked for broken bones and found 2. A fractured arm and a cracked rib. She splinted the arm with strips of hull, plating, and medical tape. The whole time, Jer watched from his patrol craft. His surveillance cameras captured everything in sharp detail. The human moving through the wreckage with practiced efficiency. The careful way she handled the alien child. The steady hands that never shook, even when the wreckage shifted and groaned around her. Jer had been trained to see humans as threats. Every simulation, every briefing, every intelligence report described them as aggressive apex predators driven by territorial instinct and pack violence. The file said humans had spent their entire history killing each other over resources, ideology, and borders they drew on maps. Nothing in those files explained what he was watching now. He opened a channel to Redis. Counselor, the human has recovered a survivor from the wreckage. A Dreckery child. She is providing medical treatment. Silence. Then, are you certain the child is Dreckery? Yes, sir. Young female, badly injured. The human is treating her wounds. Another silence, longer this time. This could be a performance. The human may know she is being observed. With respect, sir, she has been inside that wreckage for over an hour. She nearly crushed herself, moving debris off the child. If this is a performance, she is willing to die for it. Redis did not respond to that. Danny carried the unconscious child back through the wrecked corridors, moving slowly and carefully to avoid bumping the small body against anything sharp. When she reached her ship, she laid the child on the only bed in the freighter, her own, and wrapped her in every thermal blanket she had. The child stirred once, making a small sound that Danny did not recognize. Pain, maybe, or fear. Danny placed her hand gently on the child's forehead and held it there until the small body relaxed. Then she sat down at the controls and did something that made Jer's blood run cold. She activated her communication array and began broadcasting on a Dreckery emergency medical frequency. The signal was clear and simple, repeated in broken Dreckery that she had clearly learned from a translation program. Medical emergency. Dreckery child. Critical injuries. Requesting assistance. Will surrender to any vessel that provides hospital care. She was calling for help. Not from humans. Not from Sovons. From the Dreckery. A species she had no alliance with, no connection to, and no reason to trust. And she was offering to surrender herself to get the child to a doctor. Jer stared at the signal repeating on his console. He had been a military officer for 4 years. He understood sacrifice in battle. He understood loyalty to your own kind. He understood duty. He did not understand this. The signal pulsed outward into the dark, reaching Dreckery receivers, Sovon listening posts, and every ship within range of the demilitarized zone. Within minutes, the political situation went from quiet to catastrophic, and Danny Hollow sat alone in her cockpit, holding the hand of a sleeping alien child, completely unaware that she had just set 2 governments on fire. The distress signal hit 3 governments in under 10 minutes. The Dreckery ambassador sent an emergency transmission demanding to know why a human had one of their children. The Sovon Border Command wanted to know why an unregistered vessel was broadcasting on foreign military frequencies inside the demilitarized zone. And somewhere in the background, a human diplomatic office sent a quiet note asking if anyone had seen a missing freighter pilot named Danny Hollow, last known heading toward neutral space, considered non-hostile. Nobody read that last message. They were too busy shouting at each other. Admiral Soren arrived at Outpost 11 within the hour. He was old, sharp, and built like a weapon that had been used too many times. He had commanded the Sovon border fleet through the worst years of the territorial war with the Dreckery, and he had not survived that long by being gentled. He looked at the tracking data, looked at the distress signal transcript, and gave one order. Board the human vessel. Detain the pilot. Secure the Dreckery child. Jer led the boarding team. For Sovon soldiers in full combat armor, armed with pulse rifles, approaching a freighter that had no weapons and no shields. It felt wrong. It felt like hunting something that had already surrendered. They breached the airlock and moved inside with weapons raised. The interior of the ship was small and worn. The walls were covered in scratches and dents. The air smelled like medical disinfectant and something warm that Jer could not identify. Later, he would learn it was the smell of human food, something called soup, which Danny had heated for the child. They found her in the cargo bay. Danny Hollow was sitting on the floor with her back against a storage crate. The Dreckery child was sleeping in a nest of thermal blankets beside her, small chest rising and falling slowly. Danny had positioned herself between the child and the airlock door. When the Sovon soldiers entered, she did not stand. She did not reach for a weapon. She raised both hands, palms open and facing outward, and held them steady. Jer had never been this close to a human before. She was smaller than the intelligence file suggested. Her skin was a warm brown, marked with pale lines that he recognized as scar tissue. Her dark hair was cut short and uneven, as if she had done it herself with a blade. Her eyes were the thing that unsettled him most, brown and calm, and watching every soldier in the room at the same time, without moving her head. Those were predator eyes. Eyes designed to track movement and calculate distance. but there was no aggression in them. Only patience. The kid needs a hospital, Danny said. Her voice was low and steady. I do not care whose hospital. Just get her to one. Jer looked at his team. They looked back at him. Nobody had trained for this scenario. You are being detained, Jer said, keeping his voice official. You entered Sovun-controlled space without authorization. Fine, Danny said. Detain me after the kid sees a doctor. They took Danny into custody without resistance. She walked between two armed guards with her hands bound, moving with the easy posture of someone who had been arrested before and did not find it particularly interesting. The Dreckery child was transferred to the outpost medical bay, still unconscious. Counselor Redhis was waiting in the interrogation room. He sat across from Danny with a translator unit between them and studied her with all four eyes. She sat with her bound hands resting on the table and looked back at him without blinking. You are a soldier, Redhis said. Was, Danny replied. Your ship is registered to a human combat unit. Decommissioned. I bought the ship at salvage auction. It was cheap because nobody else wanted it. Why are you in the demilitarized zone? I was passing through. Picked up a faint life sign on my scanner. Went to check. You risked your life entering a destroyed vessel to save a child of a species you have no connection to. Danny shrugged. It was a human gesture that the translator could not process, so Redhis just saw her shoulders move up and down without understanding the meaning. She was alive. That was enough. Redhis leaned forward. I need you to understand something. The Sovun government and the Dreckery government have been in a fragile ceasefire for 3 years. That wreckage field is a political crisis. A human entering it and pulling out a Dreckery survivor could be interpreted as interference, as espionage, or as an act of war, depending on who is doing the interpreting. Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, there was a kid trapped under a ceiling panel with 2 broken bones and a gash in her side. She was running out of air. Was I supposed to file a diplomatic request first? Redhis opened his mouth and then closed it. He was a diplomat. He had argued with presidents and generals and species leaders across a dozen systems. He was not used to being silenced by a simple question, but he tried a different approach. Why do you care? She is not your species. She is not your responsibility. Danny tilted her head slightly, as if the question confused her. She was crying, she said. I could hear her through the wall before I found her. Small, scared sounds. Like any kid anywhere who is hurt and alone and wants someone to come. She paused and met his 4 eyes with her too. That is the only reason I have ever needed. Redhis sat back in his chair and realized, for the first time in his long career, that he was looking at something his intelligence files had never prepared him for. Redhis could not sleep. He sat in his quarters at Outpost 11 with the lights dimmed and a data screen glowing in front of him, and he read the human's file for the 3rd time. The sealed service record had taken some effort to access. Sovun intelligence had back-channel contacts in most galactic governments, including the human one, and when Redhis requested the file on Danny Hollow, the response came faster than expected, almost as if someone on the human side wanted him to see it. What he found inside made him sit very still for a long time. Danny Hollow had enlisted in her planet's military at age 19. She trained as a combat medic, which meant she was a soldier whose primary job was not to kill, but to keep other soldiers alive long enough to keep killing. Humans had a word for this role that did not translate well into Sovun. The closest meaning was one who carries the wounded. She served in a conflict on a continent called Central Africa. The details were ugly even by human standards. 2 factions fighting over mineral rights, with civilian populations trapped in the middle. Danny's unit was sent to hold a medical outpost near the front line, that on the 43rd day of deployment, her outpost was hit by a misdirected airstrike from her own side. Friendly fire, the humans called it, which Redhis thought was a very strange name for something so violent. The strike killed everyone in the outpost except Danny, who survived because she had been outside the building, treating a wounded scout. She spent the next 11 days behind enemy lines. Alone. Injured, with a medkit and nothing else. Here was the part that made Redhis read the file 3 times. During those 11 days, Danny did not try to escape. She did not try to fight. She found wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict, her own people and the enemy, and she treated them. She set bones, stitched wounds, shared her water, and carried people who could not walk to safer ground. She did not ask which side they belonged to. She did not check their uniforms or their flags. When she was finally recovered by a patrol from her own army, she was carrying an enemy soldier on her back. The soldier had a shattered leg. Danny had splinted it with sticks and strips torn from her own uniform, and she had walked 6 miles through hostile territory with him because the nearest medical camp was in that direction. Her government charged her with providing aid to enemy combatants. The trial lasted 2 weeks. She was acquitted because the military court could not find a regulation that specifically prohibited a medic from treating wounded people, regardless of which side they fought for. Danny left Earth 3 months after the trial. She bought a salvage freighter, loaded it with medical supplies, and flew into the stars without telling anyone where she was going. That was 2 years ago. Red has pulled up the ship's navigation logs, which Jer's team had downloaded during the boarding. The logs painted a picture that no intelligence analyst could have predicted. In 24 months, Danny Hollow had stopped at 14 different locations across 3 species territories. A Sovun cargo vessel that suffered an engine explosion near the Palori trade route. Danny showed up, treated the survivors, and left before anyone could identify her. A Drekari refugee convoy that was hit by space debris in the outer corridor. She docked with the damaged ships, stabilized the critically wounded, and disappeared. A Palori research station that lost atmosphere during a hull breach. She arrived, sealed the breach with materials from her own ship, and was gone within hours. She never asked for payment. She never identified herself. She never contacted any government or organization. She simply appeared wherever there was suffering, did what she could, and vanished. Redis closed the file and stared at the dark wall of his quarters. He brought the findings to Admiral Soren the next morning. The Admiral listened with his arms folded and his expression carved from stone. An elaborate cover, Soren said when Redis finished. Human intelligence services are known for deep cover operations. This woman could be building trust across multiple species territories to position herself as an asset. She was court-martialed for helping the enemy, Admiral, a convenient story to establish her legend. She has been doing this for 2 years. Alone, with no support, no funding, and a ship that is falling apart. Soren looked at him coldly. No soldier walks away from war and becomes a saint, counselor. Everyone has an agenda. Red has wanted to argue, but before he could, an alert sounded from the medical bay. The Drekari child was awake, and she was screaming. They heard it through the corridors, a high, keening wail that made every Sovun in the outpost flinch. Jer was the first to reach the medical bay. Inside, the child was pressed against the far wall, eyes wide and wild, shrieking at every Sovun who came near her. The medical staff had backed away, hands raised, unable to calm her. Jer tried speaking softly. The child screamed louder. A nurse approached with a sedative. The child threw a medical tray at her with surprising force. Then, between screams, the child said something. One word, broken and rough, shaped by a mouth that was not built for the sound she was trying to make. She said it over and over, rocking back and forth against the wall. Dane. The room went quiet. Dane. Dane. Jer looked at the nurse. The nurse looked at Jer. They both understood. The child was not calling for her parents. She was not calling for her people. She was calling for the human who had carried her out of the dark. They brought Danny to the medical bay in handcuffs. She walked between 2 guards, still wearing the same worn clothes she had been detained in, her short hair messy and her eyes tired. But the moment she stepped through the door and saw the Drekari child pressed against the far wall, something in her changed. Her posture shifted. Her shoulders dropped. The tiredness left her face and was replaced by something warm and focused. "Hey," Danny said softly. Just that one word, the child stopped screaming. Her wide, dark eyes locked onto the human, and her small body went still. Then she made a sound that needed no translation, a broken, desperate sob, and reached out with both arms. Danny looked at the guards. "Take these off, or I will sit on the floor and let her come to me. Either way, I am going to that child." Jer nodded at the guards. They removed the cuffs. Danny crossed the room in 3 steps, knelt beside the child, and gathered her carefully into her arms, mindful of the splinted arm and bandaged ribs. The child, Mava, they had learned her name from the colony ship's passenger list, buried her face in Danny's neck and held on with her six-fingered hands like she would never let go. Her small body shook with sobs that slowly, gradually, became quieter. Danny began humming. It was a simple melody, slow and soft, something from Earth that had no words. She rocked gently back and forth, one hand supporting Mava's head, the other resting on her back. Within minutes, the child was asleep. The Sovon medical staff stood in a half-circle and watched in complete silence. 3 nurses, 2 doctors, and a trauma specialist who had spent decades treating combat injuries. None of them had been able to calm a child. This human, this supposed predator from a death-class planet, had done it with a hum and a pair of arms. Jer leaned against the doorframe and felt something shift inside his chest. He had been taught that humans were dangerous. He was beginning to think that his teachers had been wrong about what that word meant. The political storm, meanwhile, was getting worse. The Drekari government had sent a diplomatic envoy to retrieve the child. 3 Drekari officials in a fast cruiser, accompanied by 2 armed escorts. They would arrive within hours, and they were not happy. A human had entered the wreckage of a Drekari ship, taken a Drekari child, and was now being held by the Sovon military. Depending on how you told the story, it sounded like a kidnapping, a provocation, or the opening move of a conspiracy. Admiral Soren saw an opportunity. If he controlled access to the child and the human, he could use them as leverage in the ongoing border negotiations. The Drekari wanted the child back. The Sovons wanted territorial concessions. Simple math. Retta stood in Soren's office and told him it was a terrible idea. She is a civilian, Retta said. She committed no crime. She saved a child's life. If we use her as a bargaining chip, we become exactly what the Drekari already think we are. She entered our space without authorization, Soren replied. That is a crime, a technical violation at best. And you know it. Soren looked at him with cold, steady eyes. I know that the border situation is more important than 1 human and 1 child. I know that sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. Redis left the office without another word. He knew Soren well enough to understand that arguing further would accomplish nothing. He needed a different approach. Back in the medical bay, Danny had been given permission to stay with Mava. She sat on the floor next to the child's bed, legs crossed, working on something with her hands. Jer watched from the corridor and saw that she was bending a piece of wire into a shape: 4 legs, a long neck, a small head. Some kind of animal from Earth. Maybe. She wrapped strips of cloth around the wire frame, creating a small, soft figure that looked vaguely like a creature with big ears. When she was satisfied, she tucked it into the blankets next to the sleeping child. Then she began teaching Mava words. Simple ones. The child was awake again, groggy but calm, and she watched Danny's mouth with intense concentration as the human pointed to things and named them. Hand, Danny said, holding up her own. Han, Mava repeated, her Drekari mouth struggling with the consonants. Good. Blanket, blanket, water, vatia. Each word earned a small nod from Danny and a gentle touch on the child's forehead. Mava began to smile. It was the first time anyone on the outpost had seen a Drekari child smile, and it looked remarkably similar to a human one. Jer realized he had been standing in the doorway for 20 minutes. He was supposed to be guarding a prisoner. Instead, he was watching a language lesson between 2 species that had never met before this week. That he thought about Soren's plan to use Danny as a bargaining chip. He thought about the wire animal tucked into the blankets. He thought about the 11 days behind enemy lines, carrying wounded soldiers who had been trying to kill her hours before. Then the communication officer's voice came over the outpost speakers, sharp and urgent. Drekari envoy has entered sensor range. 3 vessels. They will arrive in 90 minutes. Danny looked up from the language lesson. She did not know what was coming, but Jer could see in her predator eyes that she understood one thing perfectly. The calm was about to end. The Drekari envoy docked at Outpost 11 with the kind of precision that said, we are not here to negotiate. We are here to take what is ours. 3 officials stepped through the airlock. The lead diplomat was a tall Drekari female named Cinera, with silver-streaked fur and eyes that had seen too many funerals. Behind her walked two younger officials, and, further back, four armed escorts who scanned every Sovun face in the corridor with open suspicion. Redis met them at the docking port. He had prepared a careful speech about cooperation and mutual interest. He never got to deliver it. Cinera walked past him without stopping and said one sentence. "Take me to the child." They walked through the outpost in tense silence. Sovun soldiers lined the corridors, hands near their weapons. The Drekari escorts kept pace with coiled readiness. Two species that had spent decades killing each other, separated by 3 feet of hallway. Red has guided them to the medical bay. He opened the door and stepped aside. Cinera walked in and stopped. Danny was sitting on the edge of the bed. Mava was in her lap, awake and alert, holding the small wire animal that Danny had made. The human was whispering something to the child, and Mava was laughing, a soft, chirping sound that no one on the outpost had heard before. Cinera stared at the human. Her fur rose along her shoulders, which in Drekari body language meant shock, not aggression. She turned to the officials behind her and said something rapid in Drekari that the translator struggled to process. Then she looked at Redhiz and spoke in common Galactic. "Where did you find her?" "She entered the wreckage field on her own," Redhiz said. "She pulled the child from the debris and provided medical care." "I know what she did in the wreckage," Cinera said. Her voice had changed. The sharp diplomatic edge was gone, replaced by something raw. "I'm asking where you found her. This specific human." Redhiz frowned. "She was drifting through the border corridor. We tracked her vessel, and you do not understand." Cinera took a step closer to Danny, who looked up with calm, watchful eyes. "I know this human." The room went very quiet. Cinera spoke to her officials again, then turned back to Redis. 6 months ago, a reactor failure destroyed the main hub of the Paulori Crossing trade station. 47 Drekari merchants were trapped in a collapsing section. A human appeared, alone, with a medical kit and a cutting tool. She pulled 19 survivors from the wreckage, sealed wounds with her own supplies, and carried 3 people who could not walk to the escape pods. She paused. When the rescue ships arrived, the human was gone. She left nothing behind. No name, no message. The survivors called her the Quiet Walker. Cinera looked at Danny. Our merchants described a small human woman with scars on her arms and short dark hair who hummed while she worked. "I'm looking at her right now." Danny said nothing. She held Mava a little closer and watched the Drekari diplomat with an expression that was difficult to read. Not embarrassment, not pride, just the steady patience of someone who had been seen doing something she never intended anyone to notice. Admiral Soren stood in the back of the room. Redis watched the old soldier process this information. The plan to use Danny as a bargaining chip was crumbling in real time, because it was very difficult to treat someone as a political tool when the other side already considered her something close to a legend. Cinera turned to Redhiz and asked a question that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Your intelligence says humans are dangerous. You are correct. But have you considered what makes them dangerous is not their violence? It is this." She pointed at Danny and the child in her lap. "Their refusal to stop caring, even when caring might kill them. We have no defense against that. Neither do you." Soren said nothing. He turned and left the medical bay. Redis understood. The Admiral was not retreating because he was convinced. He was retreating because he had no argument left. The arrangements took 2 hours. Surviving family members had been located for Mava on a Drekari colony 3 systems away. A transport was waiting. Everything was official and proper and carefully documented. But when the time came to leave, Mava would not go. She clung to Danny with both hands and buried her face in the human shoulder. The Drekari officials waited. The Sovun guards waited. Everyone waited while a small child held on to the person who had pulled her out of the dark. Danny knelt down, so she was at Mava's eye level. She took the child's small 6-finger hands in her own and held them gently. "You're going to be okay," Danny said slowly, in the simple words she had been teaching the child all day. Mava's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her forehead against Danny's, a Drekari gesture of permanent bond. of family, of something that could not be broken by distance or time. Then she whispered the one full sentence she had learned in human language, each word careful and deliberate. "You are my people." Danny closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. She pressed her forehead back against the child's and whispered, "Yeah, kid, you are mine too." She stood up, kissed the top of Mava's furred head, and placed her gently into Sonara's arms. Then she turned and walked toward the docking bay without looking back, because looking back would have broken her. Jer watched the battered freighter detach from the outpost and drift into open space. The engines flickered once, then steadied, and the ship moved away toward the corridor. Red had stood beside him. After a long silence, the counselor said, "Update the human classification file." "To what, sir?" "Not a threat." Red has paused, watching the ship shrink to a dot on the sensor display. "Something we do not have a word for yet." Somewhere in the dark between stars, Danny Hollow sat alone in her cockpit. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, took a slow breath, and turned on her scanner. Somewhere out there, someone else needed help. She pointed her ship toward the next signal and flew.